The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. This is Simon Lovegrove speaking from Coach Source Connect Committee. I'm going to introduce Dr. Paul Brown to you. He's the face you can see at the top of the screen. And we'll be on the webinar here for the next hour or so. We're really delighted to have Paul take us through a webinar on his work. It is time for neuroscience to sharpen the edge of coaching, and we're really hoping that we can use that process to do that. So Paul's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A, and we're going to have an open mic on the Q&A, so I'll tell everybody what to do at that point. If you look to the right of your screen, you'll see a control panel. Everyone else is in listen-only mode at the moment. And when we open the mics, I'll tell you how to raise your hand so that I can open your specific microphone so that you can speak. What you'll also see on the right-hand side is a chat drop-down, so you can type messages into the chat to me or to Paul or to anyone else or to the whole room. You will also see a questions drop-down. So if you want to ask a question, you might want to just type that in there, because I'll be using that to potentially identify questions that may be interesting for everybody to hear. And the other drop downs on the right shouldn't be necessary. We don't have any handouts, do we, Paul?
No.
No. Okay, so we won't have any handouts. All right. So if we're all ready to go, Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. So here we are, just a quick read through of this. I want to introduce you to the whole concept of applied neuroscience. And it's essentially a new discipline. We cannot, most of us, claim to be neuroscientists. It's a long time since I myself had my hands on a real live brain and was cutting it up. But this new field of taking the knowledge that's coming out of neuroscience labs around the world and using it in a way that turns it into serious value, I think, is extraordinarily important. That's the field of called applied neuroscience. And I don't want to overstate how intensive this is. It's a kind of, let's introduce you to some of the ideas that are around. So I've called it a sub 101 overview. And it's a precursor to something that we've been working on for several months with KIMSI, which is the development of a 5-session short program with a further 14 sessions for a longer program. And the long program would make a person professionally competent to use this knowledge systemically in coaching. So let's get on with it. I wanted to put this slide in because it's one I rather like, Pascal's attempt to describe what the various business fads have been over quite a long period of time, the second half of the 20th century. And we see fads appearing in organizations most of the time, often driven by HR. And the question is neuroscience just going to be a fad? There's an enormous amount of stuff appearing in which you attach neuro to the front of something and it makes it look good. But I think fundamentally it's not going to be a fad. It's going to be a game changer for this reason. It is in fact an inconvenient truth. And it's going to keep worrying at the field of coaching, among others, psychotherapy would be included, but it's actually offering us an opportunity to rethink what we've thought about human behavior in organizations. Because fundamentally, the neuroscientists have raised the question, are we human beings essentially a cognitive system or fundamentally an emotional system? And the answer is profoundly the second. We have a cognitive system, but it is secondary to our emotional system. And so what we're now beginning to understand is that our thinking brain is actually making sense for us as best we can of what our brain has already decided. Our brain responds to the external world It also responds to the internal world, because the brain doesn't distinguish between a stimulus which is coming from outside and a stimulus which is coming from our thinking system, because it's just data to the brain. The brain is responding all the time to the stimuli that hit it and is making the best adaptation that it can. And I want to show you how that works. And so we're rethinking Descartes. I was very pleased with that really troubling red in Cogito Ergo Sum, because it's kind of fuzzy in a rather provocative kind of way, I think. And we actually, for the last 300 years, have done quite well out of the idea that fundamentally we get our way through the world by thinking. But the 21st century is beginning to question that. Now, the importance of applied neuroscience is in part this, that neuroscientists themselves are fascinated by the brain and the whole of the nervous system, the brain, the heart, the gut, and how the whole thing works. They're not really interested in human beings. We are the people who spend our professional lives fascinated by helping people, provoking change in all kinds of ways, provoking development, raising questions that confront people. What I'm suggesting through this emerging field of applied neuroscience is that all these labs around the world that are producing information, we can take that, it's for free, huge amounts of it, and we can turn it into value. And so we're changing Descartes' views into I feel, therefore I can think I am. It's our emotional system, and I'll come on to this in a little more detail later, but it's our emotional system that makes sense of the world. It's our thinking system that tries to put a frame of reference for us and for other people about us onto what our brain already knows. Well, if we go back to 1480, here's the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And no doubt at that stage that it was a God-centered world. And so the explanations that were available, and I'm talking across the Western world at this point, the explanations that were available across the Western world were that things were ordered in some divine way, which priests had more access to than the laity, but most of it was pretty unknowable, but certainly God was in charge. And then we get this extraordinary process in the 17th century, in which Newton and the scientists of the time begin to work out that there are real laws of the universe, and that if they can approach the systematic study of laws by what becomes experimental method, at the time it's called experimental philosophy, and that becomes physics. If they can explore in a systematic way with methodology that they've agreed upon as the method of proceeding, and they refine the methodology as they try to proceed, then the laws of the universe will become available to them. And so it's not just a descriptive view of the world, but it begins to be an explanatory view of the world. And that powered the development of science. And because it requires high-level cognitive skills, then what gets slipped into the whole of the system is the idea that it's our capacity to think that is the way that we make it all work. But actually, it's our capacity to understand what our brain has assimilated. And that's a rather different proposition. So science goes on. Here we are in 1751, about 70 years on from Newton, playing with electricity. And then if we jump another century ahead, we begin to get in the 1870s remarkable drawings of what brain cells look like. An amazing Spanish neurologist and artist called Callao begins to create the first detailed pictures with high-resolution microscopes that are appearing at the time, begins to create pictures of what the inner structure of the brain looks like. Here's another picture of the same kind. On the left, you can see two eyeballs, and he's showing us that the right eye in this picture crosses over to the left side of the brain, and the left eye crosses over largely to the right side of the brain. And you may know already that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. A phenomenon that's not entirely understood why that should be the case, but so it is, except for smell. The sensory nerves for smell come straight into the same side of the brain as the nostrils are positioned on. So the questions that are being asked at this stage about the brain is, what does it look like? And then it takes until the 1940s for more questions to be asked about, and what does it actually do? But there's one rather key figure in 1864, a chap called Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage is a foreman on the railways. He's aged 24 in America. And his job, when a hole has been drilled for putting gunpowder in, black powder as it's called at the time, in order to blast the rock apart, his job as foreman is to finish the tamping down of the powder. And what happens to Phineas Gage is that a spark is made by his iron rod striking the rock. His iron rod, which is 4 feet long, blasts up through the left side of his cheek, goes out of the top of his skull, almost obliterating his left frontal lobe. He stays conscious, is put on a wagon, is taken off to the nearest small town, amazes the local medical practitioner by his account of what has happened, and he survives. And it's very rare at that period of time for anybody to survive a massive penetrative head wound. And what happens to Phineas Gage is that his personality changes. And medicine begins to shift its attention to maybe the frontal lobes control things like personality. And that begins to develop up through the 19th century. But it's not until the 1940s that it begins to be possible to do serious systematic electrical stimulation of the brain during brain surgery to work out something about which bits of the brain do what. So at the beginning of the 20th century, we've still got the Victorian science of phrenology going around. So here's Vaught's Practical Character Reader of 1902. And phrenology is the idea that you can tell by the shape of a person's head and the bumps on the head what the brain must be creating. And so we've got a genuine husband on the left and an unreliable husband on the right. And I love the phrase on the right-hand side, young ladies, beware of such men as husbands. And here we got from the same book, a thinker and a looker. So there's a lot going on that's to do with typology. There was a member of parliament in the House of Commons in London, even in the 1960s, who still claimed that his profession was phrenology. But of course, there's absolutely no basis for the shape of the skull telling us anything about what the brain is actually up to. But what we do try to do as we go along is develop metaphors for the brain. So when I was a psychology student in 1958, what we were taught was that the brain was fundamentally a complex switchboard, messages in and then messages out. And we could kind of ignore the brain fundamentally as psychologists because it was simply a message switching system. And what we might be interested in as psychologists was behavior, not what the central mechanisms were up to. And partly that was because we really didn't have any access to looking at the brain in any organized kind of way. And then we get this kind of metaphor, which is that the brain is part of a complex computer system, and we may in fact be being inspected and listened into in all kinds of ways. And maybe this is a bit predictive of Zuckerberg's problems in some ways. But if we had this kind of diagram as psychology students up through the second half of the 20th century, we would have been pretty pleased to think, oh yes, we know a little bit about the brain. The left-hand side is the front part of the brain. the right-hand side is the back part of the brain. The back part of the brain deals with vision. The front part of the brain deals with systematic critical thought in all sorts of ways. The top part of the brain tends to deal with body positioning. Down at the bottom where it says emotional memory, we're going to be looking inside this later, but there's a lobe which is particularly concerned with managing emotions and memory. We thought that was pretty good stuff, but it was all we had. And it would be lovely if we could make it easier. Well, in 1980, we get the first reliable MRI images. So this is the first clinically useful picture of the brain in situ. Pretty fuzzy stuff, can't see much detail, but it's remarkable for its time. And then what happens as imaging technology begins to improve, and very especially in the 21st century, we begin to get the most remarkable pictures of the brain. Now, all sciences develop when you can actually see what it is you're talking about. The huge space telescopes let us understand things about the universe, which without those telescopes, we can only guess. Some years ago, I was working with one of the major oil companies, and I was shown some extraordinary maps that the geophysicists can now make of the deep structures of the Earth. They can get down 600 meters and more. Quite extraordinary, the detail. Whereas 80 years ago, if you were prospecting for oil, you kind of tried to understand what might be happening under there, but you could only understand it from being on the surface. You couldn't actually see very much underneath. And the question for us as coaches at the moment is, are we going to go on with coaching practices and models in which, in a sense, we're looking at the surface? We may have some ideas. I'm a Gestalt, I'm an integrationist, I come from a different tradition and so on. But we're actually looking from the outside. And the question I'm raising in the coaching community generally is, could we get inside? Could we look at the world through the client's eyes in such a way that we could both stay with our professional awareness that we are, on the one hand, the observer, but also imaginatively get inside our clients' heads and in a way begin to feel what it would be like to be that client. So if we can do that, we may get close to actually predicting behavior. And we would also feel a great deal more about, is the change that we're working towards actually possible? And so we go on getting better and better pictures. Here's some, very quickly, some wonderful pictures of the brain. This was a winner in a recent, last year's Neuroscience Best Pictures of the Year. And here's some fascinating work by a chap called Sebastian Sung, who at this stage was at MIT. And the question now is not what does the brain look like and what does it do? Those are still quite interesting questions. But the third question has arisen in the 21st century, how is it all connected? Here we are with 86 billion brain cells. We will often hear 100 billion, but recent work has demonstrated that 100 billion is an overestimate, and nobody can find the scientific evidence for where that thought started. But there has been some very thorough work in recent time, and the best estimate is we've got 86 billion brain cells. A brain cell can be the thickness of a human hair, or it can be 2 meters long. Each brain cell has the possibility of 10,000 connections. But by connections, we mean not actually physically connected, but the capacity to transmit chemicals from one of these red blobs to one of these green blobs. So here's a hugely magnified bit of a brain cell and its axon, which is if you can think of a brain cell as being kind of like a little tadpole egg, but it's got a long stalk coming out of it called the axon. And the electrical charge that is created by a signal hitting the brain cells, my voice into your ears, which is creating all kinds of electrical discharges through your auditory pathways, mixing it up with language pathways, which then allows you to interpret what I'm actually saying in a way that if I suddenly started speaking classical Greece, you probably couldn't understand, make meaning of what I was saying. Each signal that comes in creates an electrical discharge that travels down this long route called the axon, and at its terminal points, which are all these little red blobs that you can see, a very few. This is less than a millimeter of brain cell. At those connection points where it's touching the next cell, the green ones, there is a minute gap, 500 nanometers, which is 500 millionths of size. There is a gap, and chemicals are pushed from the red to the green and collected by the green, and that is the mechanism of transmission across the brain. It's a electrochemical process. So that's happening across 86 billion. It's an extraordinary structure. And so what Sim has done is develop methods of slicing brains, bits of brain, very, 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 very finely, and then trying to find out where the patterns are and how they're connected. And so here's one of his very beautiful demonstrations of the connectivity of something less than a cubic centimeter of a brain. So that's what your brain looks like at the moment. And the colors are different pathways and points of connection. So the enormous amount of work going on at the moment to work out what the connectome is. So structure, function, and connectivity. Now, connectivity is extremely interesting from a coaching point of view, particularly if one's working with teams, because what we know in organizations is that an enormous amount of energy is wasted between departments or across teams. And the question for the brain is how on earth does this extraordinary complex structure with highly differentiated parts to it, doing very specific things, put it all together and present it to you yourself and to the outside world as if it was a simple integrated mechanism. The complexity of it is extraordinary, but it integrates it amazingly. What is it that integrates it? And that question of how does energy flow through the brain in such a way that it makes it an integrated system is a very interesting question, both for the individual and for the organization. How does energy flow through the individual to create an integrated system, which can then release its energy into relationship and create energy within the relationship and receive energy back from within the relationship? Or how can an organization with all its differentiated systems function as if it were one? Very interesting questions. And so what we're beginning to get from the connectomics people are these amazing pictures of the fibers in the brain. This is a composite of 1,200 volunteers. You can see each of them spent 10 hours in the lab. And that's quite a lot of experimental hours. We don't know entirely what this means. In fact, we don't know really anything about what this means. But like all the great sciences, we are beginning to get the pictures, and that's when knowledge improves hugely. Another picture of the connectome. How can we actually begin to understand this kind of data? That's the way your brain is working at the moment. And here's a magnification, 3,500 times of a very small bit of brain, a mass of tangled neurons, fibers, and that's what your brain looks like at this moment. Here's a single cell, and here it is connecting off into all kinds of pathways. Amazing tangle of stuff. 86 billion of those in 3.5 pounds of the squidgy stuff of your brain. And so in University of Pennsylvania, where there's a lot of very fine work going on, they've created a brain map to try and look at what happens to Alzheimer's. And if any of you have had the unhappy process of watching somebody you love deteriorate through an Alzheimer kind of condition, you can begin to see that they can't put it together any longer. The connectivity starts breaking down, and bit by bit, the central integrator, the thing that we can otherwise call the self, the mechanism that makes it all familiar, starts breaking down too, and we have a sense that the person isn't the person that they used to be. And here's, just for your reference, subsequently, an illustrated diagram of chemicals. So at the top, we've got an axon, an electrical charge comes down, and then it releases all the chemicals. They flow across this very, very small gap and are picked up. But you can imagine all kinds of things can go wrong in this system, and a lot of research is going on to find out what the neurochemicals are up to. More pictures. I won't bore you with all of these, but remarkable pictures. But here is a picture of the connectivity of a mouse's brain. And the mouse is one of the favorite experimental analogues for working on the brain. Okay, going back to Cayal, the wonderful Spanish neurosurgeon and illustrator, there's one particular type of cell, an interneuron. And when Cayal drew this, he said they were the butterflies of the soul. It's a rather beautiful image. In the commercial world, the people who are taking up neuroscience most rapidly are the marketing people, because of the insights it can give them into all kinds of consumer behavior. And some of the large international marketing organizations and branding organizations now have major departments with one of them has 20 postdoc neuroscientists doing serious research on the brain in order to help marketing. But the University of Pennsylvania, in December 2013, published these. And these are the composite results of nearly 1,000 male and female brains. Not quite 500 and 500, but almost. The age range was 8 to 22. So these are composites. And I wonder if you can guess which is the male brain and which is the female brain. Well, there we are at the bottom. It says increased connectivity in males in each hemisphere. So the two sides of the brain are doing different things. They're also needing to interconnect because the brain is a whole system. But it looks as if men choose either or. They can be in their left brain or their right brain. I should say the front of the brain is at the top of the picture all the time here. So males choose to be in one side or the other. But you can see in the female brain, the bottom images, huge cross-laterality. Women are knitting the thing together the whole time. Men are in either or. Women are in both and. And I've begun to explore the idea of, does this suggest to us that men are very good at problem solving, whereas women are very good at solution seeking? Now, the real importance of this for our own work is that we may have to begin to think about how do we coach if the brain of the person may be different from the way my brain works. That's itself an interesting question. A much larger question is to help organizations get out of the jam that's arisen because of the demand for equality. Equality is a very awkward concept. You can measure it in pay terms, but it's a very unsatisfactory measure of what we really mean by equality. And it's probable that the full meaning of equality is something that can never actually be reached. Maybe in organizations, we should be beginning to be brave enough to say, actually, male and female brains work differently. What we've done in the 20th century as women made this amazing claim to come into the world in their own right, which is the great achievement of feminism. Maybe we should recognize that what we've asked women to do in organizations is become the best men they could be. And maybe women actually bring something that is quite different from men in the way that they think and function. And we should learn to value that. But we haven't seen many demonstrations yet of how it works, because we've required women to work within male systems. There's a very fascinating book by a man called Frederick Laloux called Reinventing Organizations. And though his theorizing is rather superficial, his field work is, I think, wonderful. He's gone out and found organizations which have redefined themselves in a variety of ways, but he comes up with a kind of understanding that an organization which has got high level of relationship based upon trust, and that has got a sense of real purpose, creates an environment in which people's energy flows into the organization. And that results in profit. And that's a very fascinating kind of concept. And women understand more about cooperative relationships, perhaps, than men do. This is complicated a bit more by the fact that the brain itself can be typed as being either male or female. So a man may have a rather more feminine brain in the way that it works. A woman may have a rather more masculine brain in the way it works. There are methods of working out which one is presenting to you. The other thing that's not much explored in coaching is what is it really like for a woman to be coached by a man, or a man to spend an hour once a month, 2 hours once a month, to have available on the end of a phone if he needs it, a highly capable woman coach. And he's thinking about himself. It's a very fascinating question of how do we use the relationship to create high levels of trust, because we know that when the brain trusts another person, it opens itself up to the possibility of change. Now, I'm not going to pull this slide up, but I would suggest to you that subsequently, when you get these slides, you have a look at this work from the Gallant lab. It's a remarkable demonstration of technology that's developed over the last 10 years as to how to explore meaning in the brain. But this is the one slide that I would like you to burn into your own brains. This is something that I carry with me in laminate form and use all the time. It's a three-part brain. 1975, an American biologist asked a fascinating question, which was, we've been taught that mammals, warm-blooded animals like us, have live young. Absolutely true. But MacLean said, what happened to the brain when evolution started producing mammals? Because the existence of live young presumes that there must be some kind of working relationship by which the young are safeguarded until they've got maturity. Maybe 3 months for puppies, 2 years for lions and tigers, arguably 24 years for human beings, well, whatever it is. There must be something. And he began to think about the central part of the brain called the limbic system, or the mammalian brain, which is where emotions and memory are stored. And then in the evolution of the brain, you get this huge folded development of the thing called the cortex, which is where the system is being explored by itself in order to make sense of itself, in order to make sense of it for us. So we are the only organism, so far as we know, that make systematic verbal sense that can be recorded in a reliable way by language, and that language itself can change and create new meanings. Now, interestingly, in the development of the embryo in the womb, the brain stem, the snake brain, develops first of all, because that's managing everything to do with the automatic functions in your body, keeping you alive: breathing, respiration, perspiration, elimination, all the things that your body needs to be doing, and it does it for a snake. And if you think of a long spinal column, a little brain on the top of it, a snake, this part of the brain does everything to keep that snake functioning. That's all that snake has got. So you can't actually create a relationship with a snake. It doesn't smile back at you. But you can with most mammals. And the more advanced the mammal in cortical terms, the more of the relationship you can actually make. But there's this very important bit called the amygdala. So this almond shape, amygdala, amygdalon, is the Greek word for almond. And there are two of these, hence amygdala is a plural word, a bit like data. We use it in plural and singular forms. So there's another one on the other side, slightly hidden by the structures. And the amygdala has the task all the time in a baby of assigning emotion to an event. And it's the assigning of the emotion that makes meaning. So data comes in, it hits the amygdala, it's assigned an emotion, and then that is distributed up into the cortex. So we now know the brain is a bottom-up system. Through the five senses, data comes in, is assessed by the amygdala, is given the appropriate emotional context, and is then distributed in the cortex. And then when we're grown up, the amygdala is instantly assessing every signal that comes in for its emotional loading, and is putting that signal onto an appropriate pathway. Its preferential awareness is for danger. So that's the thing that safeguards us, and it can mobilize the whole of the brain in 85 milliseconds when danger comes. And danger may be just our kind of danger. I don't like this kind of person would be danger for me, or any one of us. If something had happened in our experience that created a particular pathway of a particular character, having particular qualities. And the reason we fall in love with the people that we fall in love with is because they have qualities that the amygdala can work out, that we often cannot put words to, but the amygdala knows that it fits for us. So this is very important, that the brain is fundamentally organized to test everything through the emotional system. All decisions are tested fundamentally through the emotional system, which is why people can get so locked into their own decisions. Set of data may be very complex. People arrive at completely different conclusions and defend their own conclusions because for them it makes sense, and the sense making is made through their own feeling about the system. Now, there's a bit of the brain called the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which you can see there, bottom part of the frontal brain, which is very key for adaptive decision making. But the brain is fundamentally an energy system. It runs off 25 watts of, 25 watts of power. The body as a whole runs off 95 watts. The brain is only 4% of body mass. So it consumes an enormous amount of energy. But the energy will preferentially be taken towards survival, not towards creativity. So if we're going to work worrying about a teenager who's going off the rails a bit, worrying about where do we find a nursing home for an aging parent, worrying about, just hating the boss that we've got. The energy of the brain is being used to manage that and is not available for this very important area of the prefrontal cortex. When we are in good, trusting relationships, when we feel regarded, when we're able to say thank you to other people, when we create relationships which are of proper mutual dependency, this right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex gets very filled with energy and enables all kinds of decision making. There are, in fact, 8 basic emotions. And it's useful to think of the basic emotions like the 3 primary colors. So the 3 primary colors create the whole of the color spectrum. The 8 primary emotions produce the whole of the feeling system. And we're now trying to use the word emotion as very specific to what I'm about to show you. The emotions combine together to create feelings. And so if we look at this thing called potentiator, surprise, startle, you're coming to this webinar this evening, this morning in your time, maybe. You're coming to this webinar wondering, oh, I wonder what it's going to be like. That's a bit of the surprise emotion. And if we go left around this fan, we've got fear, anger, disgust, shame, and sadness. And these are the escape avoidance survival emotions. If we didn't have those, we wouldn't on an evolutionary basis have got here. On the other side of the fan, we've got the great emotions of human experience, excitement, joy, love, and trust. But they have no primary survival value. You can live the whole of a life without those, and it's an awful life, but you will survive. But these, the attachment emotions, are what give excitement, what give color, what give purpose and meaning to a life that is rich. Well, how could we run companies off enough excitement and enough joy, real trust, and we go to work saying, I love my job? You go because of the quality of encounter with the challenges that you meet and the quality of encounter with the people that we meet. And then, interestingly, energy flows outwards. Whereas with the survival emotions, energy, first of all, goes to looking after yourself. There's a lot more behind this, but this understanding of the basic emotions is, I think, extraordinarily important, because in getting to understand our client, what we need to be able to do is to understand their essential emotional patterning, because that is resonating throughout the whole of their adult life behavior. It happens in the first 3 years of life. It's tested and grown and developed in a variety of ways, but we need to be able to read the emotional system of our clients to know how they're really behaving. And then we can put the neurochemicals to them. There's the stress hormone cortisol, the pleasure-seeking hormones, dopamine, and so on. And we've got this fright, fight, flight, faint. Eventually, the system has to close down and we faint. Or we've got something that feels wonderful, and the opposite of fight and flight is frolic. You can see children just enjoying themselves. And that allows us, I'm going to rush slightly, we've got just a few more slides. That allows us to begin to think about what is the nature of mind in a way that we've never been able to think of before. And Dan Siegel from UCLA has proposed that we can see a mind operating by the way the brain continuously manages the dynamic integration of information, energy, and relationship. And what we've done in 20th and 21st century organizations is we've maxed on information, we've ignored energy, so people get highly stressed, and we've commercialized and relationships in such a way that there are protocols now of how people are to behave, and they're losing their spontaneity and behavior. And that's a way of the organization getting into more and more and more trouble. Unfortunately, we now have a lot of legislation which relies upon protocols of behavior, that we're killing people's natural capacity to relate. And then there's a field called epigenetics. And very quickly, epigenetics is what happens around the gene. So the 20th century taught us that genes control our behavior. But the cell biologists about 20 years ago began to be very aware that the genes can express themselves in a wide variety of ways. What is it that tells the gene how to express itself? And the answer is the whole of your life experience, the moment you see anything, creates a neurochemistry which goes to the gene. The gene then tells the RNA, the the gene is the DNA. The DNA tells the RNA what proteins to create in order to mobilize behavior. So we now have a working model that it's perception based upon experience that actually controls our behavior. And if we can't change the emotional system that changes the perception, we can't really change behavior. Now, I'm very troubled by the positive psychology movement, which is emphasizing happiness, because I don't think happiness has got a huge amount of operational value for us. Happiness is a state, not an emotion, because it implies no particular action, it simply is. And yet, positive psychology has tended to emphasize happiness and has tended to imply that there are positive emotions and there are negative emotions. I think that's really nonsense. It's a whole system. Fear, anger, disgust, shame, and sadness are very important to our understanding of the world. If we didn't have them, we would be lost. And yet, I've seen experiences with social workers where if a mother is making a child appropriately anxious or appropriately angry, the social worker is saying, that's wrong. That's a bad parent. You are dealing with negative emotions. It's not true. The escape avoidance emotions are like a storm. We need rain. If the rain creates sewers to back up and filth floats around, that is disgusting, as it is with rage that is badly managed, fear that is badly managed. But actually, we need storms, and we need the escape avoidance emotions for a whole system. Yet we do know that the people who have been pursuing contemplative lives can produce remarkable effects in the brain. So we've got in this peak here 150 people. If you look to the very left-hand end, somebody who is an adept at creating inside themselves a transcendental state produces brain waves of a kind that simply don't appear in the normal population. I want to leave you with a final thought on happiness. There is no way to happiness. Happiness is the way. Well, thank you. We've got 10 minutes, 12 minutes for questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. I'm not sure if you can see the questions, but everyone's very, very appreciative of the and very excited by the information. I'm going to go to the question list. I can see some with their hands up and some have already asked questions. Nancy, I'm going to unmute you now for your question. Please go ahead.
Yes, I actually forgot what my question is. Hi, this was actually really, really fascinating information. And so I wanted to know, have you seen any of the coaching programs starting to integrate this pieces around neuroscience?
I have to confess, I don't track lots of coaching programs, so the answer is I'm not really sure. What I think we need to develop in the profession is a kind of post-qualification development in which there is some way of getting hold of this information. I myself run something called the Science of the Art of Coaching program, which is a 10-month program delivered on a face-to-face way with webinars. CoachSource is the first international coaching organization which has decided it wants to make an offering available to all its members. I also have an online MSc in Applied Neuroscience and Organization. The Maudsley Hospital in London has just produced a new Applied Neuroscience degree, but it's to do with clinical applications only, not to do with organizational applications. So it's a very emerging field. I have 10 doctoral students now, all of whom are working on very interesting issues from a applied neuroscience perspective. So we're beginning to found a new body of knowledge, which I mean, this isn't the only way of doing coaching, but my own view increasingly is that this is something that anybody with a serious practice in coaching needs to begin to think about. How do I integrate this with the way I already think about people? Because it will give me new insights.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Great. Thank you very much, Nancy. I'm going to ask a question now from Louise Corver, who is not able to ask it herself. Let me just mute you back, Nancy. So Louise's question is, how does the research align or cause questions with the research into the Herman brain science work?
I'd have to be told what the Herman brain science work is.
Does anybody, if anybody knows what that is, can you raise your hand? Oh, wait, here we go. Janet, I'm going to unmute you. Hang on, here we go. Come on, unmute Janet. Janet, you're on.
Okay. Hello? Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, sure.
What?
Go ahead, Janet.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm familiar with the Herman work and also something that came out of that called the Bensinger Thinking Style Assessment. I've used it in my coaching practice for over 15 years. It's very interesting, and one of the things I find, which I'm glad you mentioned, Paul, was the fact that there are male and female brains, which is sort of how we've stereotyped them, but there are males who act more female in how they think, and same for females.
Yes.
And so there's four different thinking styles, and basically what Bensinger says, here's where I think the real critical issue is, which is probably something we're still learning about. What I hear a lot from people in the coaching field is talking all about how we can change people's behavior. What Bensinger believes is that we all come into the world with a certain brain structure that is natural for us, and that as long as we operate in a way that is consistent to our natural wiring, we're going to be more energy efficient than if we're trying to be something we're not. So there's a certain amount you can develop, but you have to really sort of honor your natural wiring. Otherwise, you're working against your own energetic system.
I think that's such a helpful observation, because the new model for the 21st century organization is not about how do we manage people, how do we control things. It's about how do we release people. Because
Absolutely.
people are self-regulating systems, and they've got enormous stores of energy, which many organizations get about, I think, 20% of what the person has on offer. And yet people can look very busy, very active, they can be very exhausted, but actually the energy is not flowing because the systems, the fights, the politics, the interdepartmental rivalries, a lot of the stuff that is very male consumes energy in a busyness that has very little impact upon the long-term goals of the organization. And so my own kind of very quick synthesis at the moment is that what we're needing to do is create organizations under which energy flows towards the operational and strategic goals of the organization. And the question for the leader, the kind of people that we're coaching very often, is then how do I manage my brain in such a way that I get other people's brains to tune to me in such a way that they willingly release their energy in the direction of these operational and strategic goals. And yes. I think we've now got the option of beginning to talk not only from a kind of experiential point of view, but from a scientific point of view of why that's important and how it can be done.
Well, and it's also, I think what I'm seeing is that the leader, depending on what kind of situation we're in, needs to be a different kind of leader. For instance, if you're in a stable situation where leadership is all about managing the operation so that it continues to do what it's always done, that's a good thing. But if you're in during a time of massive change, you have to have a different kind of leader that can help the organization move in the direction it needs to move in.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Or you have to have a leader who is using him or herself differently.
Well, depending on whether they can do that or not. I mean, some people are who they are, and they're probably better staying in a job that requires them to use what they're already good at.
And it's part of the skill of a coach who can get inside the head of another person to see their emotional patterning, explore their life history, to know whether or not that using themselves differently is possible or not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Good. Super.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. I'm going to ask a couple of questions on behalf of now, just to coming before the hour. Anya Marika, you've asked, can you advise us on some readings to take us deeper into the topic, Paul?
I did a book with a colleague about 5 years ago now called Neuroscience for Coaches. Sorry, Neuropsychology for Coaches, Understanding the Basics. And that might be helpful. It's by me, Paul Brown, and an unrelated colleague called Virginia Brown. So Neuropsychology for Coaches, Understanding the Basics. And then more recently, a book called The Fear-Free Organization. I wanted to try and make a first statement of something that I'm working towards in a fuller form, which is to develop an integrated theory of the individual and the organization.
Wow.
But this book is called The Fear-Free Organization. And again, it's by me, Brown, somebody called Chisholm, Chisholm, Lady Kitty Chisholm, and Kingsley. Sorry, the order is Brown, Kingsley, and Chisholm.
Okay, super. Thank you. A couple of people have asked, will they be able to have copies of the slides or PDFs of the slides?
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Okay, we're just coming up to the hour, so I'm going to read the questions. And Paul, are you good for a few minutes after the hour?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, sorry. Okay. So this is from Keith Lewis. Do you relate adult development theory and brain neuroscience? If so, how do you see these integrating?
Right. If we go back into adult development theory, we're going back to something called, where would we start? Probably with Seasons of a Man's Life. You know, psychology concentrates a lot on early childhood, later childhood, adolescence, and then kind of got interested in old age, but sort of assumed that across the middle years, it was a bit like an upland plateau of some kind. You just kind of wandered across it. And I just lost the name of the American who did Seasons of a Man's Life in the 1960s. But he started looking at white American males and what happened to them over the course of their life, and categorized phases. Well, I think the whole of adult life development is linked to the sense that by about age 24, our brain has not only assumed its full size, which it's done at the age of 13, it's filled itself up with the data that will take it into the adult world. When I was a psychology student, we were taught the brain was mature at 13, but in fact, it was anatomically at full size at 13, but whatever happens to it during adolescence is huge, and it settles down into its preferred style by about the age of 24. And from then on, I think what's happening is that the brain is continuously testing out its own assumptions against the world and maybe modifying them a bit. There's this whole area of plasticity, which is the sense that the brain is much more malleable than we used to think it was. And so the brain, being an amazing learning organism, will go on learning if it has acquired the habit of learning. But it won't go on learning if it hasn't acquired the habits of learning. I did some work at one stage in a young offenders institution, and whenever one sees boys, this was between the ages of 16 and 18, locked away inside a young offenders institution in a very impoverished environment, one of the sort of natural questions is, well, why don't they learn? In fact, what they've learned to do is to be good thieves. And the fact that they've been in prison is more of a badge of honor than a disgrace in the systems that they work. So the brain is geared around being who they are, not simply responding to social pressures. And so changing people in those circumstances is extraordinarily difficult, and we do it very, very badly indeed, in my view. That's a kind of wandering answer to the question, and I think not a very fulfilling answer. The brain itself, there's two extraordinary papers just in the last fortnight. One of them saying that the brain goes on creating new brain cells through adult life, and the other one saying absolutely the brain doesn't create new brain cells through adult life. There is, however, some very good evidence, I think, that an 8-week course of mindfulness will create new brain cells. How many? About 35,000 is the best estimate. That's not a lot against 86 billion. So neurogenesis, it's called, the generating of new neurons, is being a bit overdone, I think, just as I think plasticity has been a bit overdone. But nevertheless, the brain is a much more fundamentally adaptive organ if it has been taught the adaptation that is being required of it. So, for instance, all of us listening to this could speak Mandarin. Maybe some listening to this do speak Mandarin, but anybody who doesn't, you could in principle speak Mandarin. I've spent time living in China, and isn't it wonderful how a 3-year-old can speak fluent Mandarin, just as we speak fluent English. But we don't want to commit time, effort, and energy, most of us, to learning Mandarin, because it has no particular value to us. Now, I think a lot of people come into coaching, having had a discussion with HR, who have set some goals that become the agreed goals for coaching, without there having been real questioning as to the fundamental wish to change. So the person thinks it would be nice to change, but actually has got no serious internal commitment to change. Another thing I observe in my own supervision is that the coach may have an hour or two with a client, and the client goes away saying, that was wonderful, thank you, I feel hugely better, really appreciative. The coach feels, gosh, what a good job I've done today. And actually, the real question is, what happened between that session and the next? And the answer is, not much, it was very busy. Well, I think the quality of relationship that a good coach can create is profoundly important, but it's the beginning of creating the conditions under which then the person is really provoked into the change that is being sought, if that's what the program is about. And so I think we need to help coaches understand that they are in charge of the client's brain. Another thing that happens in coaching is that very often the person who comes is very adept at taking charge of all social situations, comes in, very good greeting, has got a funny story to tell or something like that. And the coach is responding to the client, not the client to the coach. And my own view of a coaching encounter is the coach needs to know how to get the client's brain to tune to the coach's brain, because the coach, its professional task is to modify the client's brain the client being willing to have his or her brain modified, because we're in the business of changing brains. Because without a change in the brain, there can't be any change in behavior.
Great. Thank you. There's actually more questions that we're going to be able to do. So I'm going to just go for two more real pieces. One is, first of all, Paul, would you like to speak just a little bit about the program that's coming up? Because a couple of people have asked about, well, how do we do this in practice as coaches? So that's one direction. And I do want to go back just on a couple of people asked questions very early on about masculine and female, male and female brains, masculine brain, whatever we call it. Questions around that. Can a woman/man change or adjust and strengthen her brain so that she has more of a masculine brain and vice versa? And another question from Adrienne Milic. Are you familiar with Luann Brisendine's books on the female and male brains? If so, please share thoughts. So those two things really, the program and the male-female brain conundrum.
Okay, let me deal with the male-female brain stuff first of all. Louise Brisendine's work, I think, has been very important. It's been seriously attacked. And she's making a very strong case all the time for there being major differences between the male and female brain. But one can still see big headlines come up saying there are no difference between men's and women's brains. It's inconceivable to me that there couldn't be differences, that there must be differences, because we're in this world from a fundamental biological point of view for completely different purposes. And the tasks that we have in ensuring that our species survive, this is just taking a straight evolutionary view, the tasks that each of us have as male or female in the continuation of the species is massively different. Different behaviors are required of us. And in consequences, our brains must be different. But this very interesting understanding that the brain is not necessarily closely linked to observable sex differences, that the brain itself may be more or less male or female, is, I think, very interesting. I haven't myself yet formulated quite what I mean about feminine energy. But when I'm in the presence of feminine energy, I experience it as profoundly different from male energy. And what we haven't seen is a valuing of that kind of energy properly. And I think it's very important that out of this kind of knowledge base, we as coaches, we are the only profession that actually has the opportunity to work with high-powered people who are not complaining of being ill, but are in a relationship with us for some aspect of their own inquiry about themselves, which may be a developmental process. And we're immensely privileged. The more we can understand this person, the more fun we're going to have and the more benefit we're going to be for them. And the male-female difference is a hugely important emerging field. If I can leave that one there and come back to the second question.
Yes, please.
Which is the program that CoachSource has asked us to create for them. The brief history of this is about 9 years ago, when I began to be really interested in teaching this area. I set up in London something called a neuro group, and a group of us coaches used to meet on a monthly basis for 6 months, and we had an hour and a half together once a month, and I was beginning to talk about what I was understanding about the brain. I used to teach neuropsychology to MSc clinical students many years ago, and though I'd lost slight touch with it, as the late part of the last century began to develop a real understanding that the world was shifting and we were getting information about how the brain really worked, I began to revive my interest in it. And that then developed into something that the Association of Coaching provoked, which was a more systematic program that became the science of the art of coaching, and that became a 10-month program. We meet once a quarter for 2 days and then have webinars in between. So we meet for 8 working days, and they're very energetic and good fun days. But CoachSource, Kimsey heard me speaking at an EMCC conference just a year ago, and over the last several months has been provoking the question of what can you create that we can do online. And so we've devised a program in which people can opt into a short version. So that would be a really 101. As you saw, I said this is a sub 101. The 5 session is a 101. It's a seriously detailed introduction to the way the brain works. But the longer program is, and how do you really put that into use? What you're doing with it? How, for instance, do you take a systematic biographical inquiry, which is not just how do you understand the CV and what the person has done, but what actually were their early emotional experiences like? What happened in their family system? Where does their own understanding of hierarchy come from? What is their emotional tapestry? And so part of it is how do I get inside the person using a frame of reference in which I, as a coach, have some sense of knowing where I'm going and what I'm looking for. And so that's going to start in July, and people can do the 5-week session and then decide to opt into the longer one. They can opt into the longer one at the beginning. And they will have ICF credits attached to them. The ICF credits have been awarded already for the first 5 sessions. The application for the longer program was a much longer application, and we're expecting it back within the next 3 weeks. Is that enough of an answer?
I think that sounds just wonderful, actually. In fact, I was just replying to Andrew because he asked, can we reprogram our amygdala so that we react or respond differently to external data? And I was just replying that actually you were framing the response to that in the description of the program. So,
it's actually, but it's a super question. The amygdala is an extraordinary bit of the brain. Everything flows through it. So when you're worrying about something, the amygdala is picking up the fact that you're worrying. It's then telling the system to worry, which goes on increasing the worry. And that's how we can get into ruminative worrying sometimes. We can't kind of get out of it. And we can know it, we can try to get out of it, but we keep coming back to it because our amygdala is acting as the guardian of the whole of our system. And if we are seriously worried about something, it will keep wanting to direct our attention to it because it's important for our well-being that we do, in fact, solve the worrying that we're engaged in. The amygdala can't be reprogrammed, but it can be got into a state of rest in such a way that it opens up the possibility of new pathways being created in the brain. And that is to do with attaching different emotions to experience, which then create new pathways. So the amygdala can be got into a state of quietness. If anybody here is deeply engaged by wonderful music, you will recognize a state in which you are so in touch with the music that nothing else actually worries you, nothing else concerns you. And at that moment, the amygdala has switched off its worrying capacities, its capacities for looking for danger. If, on the other hand, in the middle of a wonderful concert that you're at, where you're completely absorbed, suddenly a gunshot went off in the room, your amygdala would have you jumping faster than the speed of light without any thought. So the amygdala can be got into a state of rest. It can't be reprogrammed. I've never been asked that question before, but I'm pretty confident about that answer.
That's a fantastic answer. I'm just doing 2 things at once and therefore stretching the capacity of my cognitive part, but nevertheless feeling good about it.
Very good.
All right,
Thank you, everybody.
I'm sorry, everyone. I'm sorry. I'm going to close there. There will be a replay link put up. I will try and find some way of adding capturing these questions and supplying them to Paul, perhaps for his next webinar, which will be this evening Pacific time, sometime in the morning European, and tomorrow morning in Asia. And I will also figure out a way that we can get the link to the PDF of the slides with the replay link when it goes out. So Paul, so thank you very much. Everyone's extremely excited by the content. It's really firing a lot of different connections for everybody, I can assure you. So doing what it says on the tin. So thanks very much, and thanks very much everybody for your questions as well. Thank you.
Simon, thank you very much indeed for hosting this.
Hang on. All right, let me just close the webinar. All right, I'm now closing the webinar. All right, thanks everybody. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Paul.
Simon, bye-bye, and thank you so much.